The year is 897. In the heart of Rome, within the cold stone walls of the Basilica of St. John Lateran, a trial is about to begin. But this is no ordinary trial. The accused sits motionless in a throne, dressed in full papal regalia, silent and unmoving. He cannot speak. He cannot defend himself. He cannot even acknowledge the charges being hurled at him by his successor. For Pope Formosus is dead. He has been dead for 9 months. His body, exhumed from its tomb in St. Peter's Basilica, now sits decomposing before the assembled clergy of Rome, propped up like a grotesque puppet in what will become one of the most bizarre and disturbing spectacles in the history of the Catholic Church. This is the Cadaver Synod, and its origins lie in the violent, chaotic world of 9th century Italy, where popes were made and unmade by warlords, where the throne of St. Peter had become a prize to be seized by force, and where the line between spiritual authority and temporal power had been blurred beyond recognition. To understand how the Church of Rome descended into such macabre theater, we must journey back several decades, to a time when the papal throne was caught in a web of Italian noble families, Frankish emperors, and Byzantine ambitions. The papacy of the late 9th century was not the unified, authoritative institution it would later become. It was a political football, kicked between competing factions who saw the Bishop of Rome not primarily as the successor to St. Peter, but as a key to controlling the Eternal City and, by extension, central Italy itself. The collapse of the Carolingian Empire, which had once provided a degree of stability to Western Europe under Charlemagne and his immediate successors, had left a power vacuum. Italy became a battlefield where local strongmen, ambitious nobles, and would-be emperors fought for supremacy, and the papacy was inevitably drawn into their schemes. Into this turbulent world came Formosus. Born around 816, probably in Rome or the nearby region of Lazio, Formosus rose through the ecclesiastical ranks with intelligence and capability. He served as Bishop of Porto, one of the suburbicarian sees near Rome, and became a trusted advisor to Pope Nicholas I, one of the most powerful and respected popes of the 9th century. Formosus was a skilled diplomat, sent on missions to Bulgaria to negotiate with the newly Christianized Slavic kingdom, and to Francia to navigate the treacherous politics of the fragmenting Carolingian realm. But his very success made him enemies. In the Byzantine-influenced world of 9th century church politics, where factions formed around competing visions of papal authority and allegiance to different secular powers, Formosus found himself on the wrong side of Pope John VIII. John VIII, who reigned from 872 to 882, was a pope constantly under siege, literally and figuratively. The Saracens threatened Rome from their bases in southern Italy. The Byzantine Empire sought to extend its influence over the Italian peninsula. Local nobles, particularly the powerful Duke Lambert of Spoleto and his formidable mother, Agiltrude, were carving out their own domains. Into this chaos, John VIII struggled to maintain papal authority, and he viewed Formosus with deep suspicion. In 876, John VIII accused Formosus and several other bishops of conspiring against him, of abandoning their sees, and of plotting with secular powers to undermine his papacy. Formosus was excommunicated, stripped of his bishopric, and forced to flee Rome. The charges were serious, not only abandoning his episcopal duties, but also allegedly aspiring to the papal throne itself, a crime considered among the gravest in church law. For years, Formosus lived in exile, a prominent churchman cast out from the very institution he had served with distinction. But the wheel of fortune, which spun so rapidly in the treacherous politics of medieval Rome, would turn in his favor. Pope John VIII was assassinated in 882, the first pope to die by violence, his skull crushed by a hammer after an attempted poisoning failed to kill him quickly enough for his conspirators' liking. His successors, Marinus I, Hadrian III, and Stephen V, each reigned briefly, their papacies marked by the same violent political struggles that had defined John VIII's rule. Under Marinus I, Formosus was rehabilitated, his excommunication lifted, and he was restored to his position as Bishop of Porto. He had survived. And in October 891, when Pope Stephen V died, the clergy and people of Rome elected Formosus to the throne of St. Peter. Formosus became pope at perhaps the worst possible moment in the history of the medieval papacy. Italy was fragmented among competing powers. The Carolingian Empire in the west had splintered into rival kingdoms ruled by squabbling descendants of Charlemagne. The Byzantine Empire in the east was losing its grip on southern Italy but still maintained ambitions there. Most threatening of all were the powerful Italian noble families who saw the papacy as an instrument to legitimize their own territorial ambitions. Chief among these was the House of Spoleto. Duke Guy III of Spoleto, with his ambitious wife Agiltrude at his side, had already crowned himself King of Italy in 889 and was determined to add the imperial crown to his collection of titles. For Guy and Agiltrude, controlling the Pope meant controlling who could legitimately claim to be Holy Roman Emperor, for it was the Pope alone who could confer that sacred dignity. Formosus faced an impossible dilemma. Guy of Spoleto had effectively forced the previous Pope, Stephen V, to crown him co-emperor alongside his son Lambert in 892. Now, as Pope, Formosus found himself trapped between the Spoletan dynasty's demands for legitimacy and his own conviction that they were unworthy of imperial dignity. The sources from this period are fragmentary and partisan, written by later chroniclers with their own axes to grind, but they suggest that Formosus harbored deep reservations about the Spoletans. Guy was a warrior duke, skilled in battle but crude in diplomacy, and his wife Agiltrude was considered by contemporaries to be ruthlessly ambitious. More importantly, the Spoletan dynasty represented everything that Formosus believed was wrong with the current state of affairs. Secular nobles using the papacy as a tool to legitimize their own power rather than serving the spiritual mission of the Church. So Formosus made a fateful decision. He would seek a counterweight to Spoletan power by inviting a new player onto the Italian chessboard. He sent emissaries across the Alps to Arnulf of Carinthia, the illegitimate but capable son of Carloman of Bavaria and one of the last viable claimants to the Carolingian legacy. Arnulf controlled the East Frankish kingdom, essentially what would become Germany, and had proven himself a formidable military leader. Formosus invited Arnulf to come to Italy, to drive out the Spoletans, and to receive the imperial crown from the Pope's own hands. It was a desperate gamble, an attempt to restore what Formosus saw as the proper order, with a legitimate Carolingian emperor protecting the papacy rather than Italian strongmen holding it hostage. Arnulf responded to the call. In 894, he marched his army across the Alps and into northern Italy. The campaign was initially successful. Arnulf defeated Guy of Spoleto's forces and pushed southward toward Rome. But before the matter could be conclusively settled, Guy died, possibly of natural causes, in late 894. This left his young son Lambert as King of Italy and co-emperor, with the redoubtable Agiltrude as regent and the true power behind the throne. Formosus crowned Arnulf as Holy Roman Emperor in Rome in February 896, hoping that this would finally break the Spoletan hold on Italy. But fate, as so often in this period of Italian history, intervened in unexpected ways. Arnulf suffered a stroke shortly after his coronation, leaving him partially paralyzed. Unable to continue his campaign, he withdrew back to Germany, taking his army with him and leaving Formosus and Rome vulnerable to Spoletan revenge. Pope Formosus died on April 4, 896, possibly of natural causes, though in that violent age, poison was always suspected when a politically inconvenient figure passed away suddenly. He had reigned for less than 5 years, years consumed by the political machinations and military conflicts that had defined his papacy. He was buried with honor in St. Peter's Basilica, and for a moment, it seemed that the controversies of his reign would be buried with him. But Formosus had made powerful enemies, and chief among them was Agiltrude, the Dowager Duchess of Spoleto and mother of the young Emperor Lambert. Formosus had tried to strip her son of his imperial dignity, had invited foreign armies into Italy to destroy her family's power, and had treated the Spoletan claim to the imperial throne with contempt. Agiltrude was not a woman to forgive such insults, and now, with Formosus dead and Arnulf safely distant in Germany, she saw an opportunity for revenge. The succession after Formosus's death was turbulent. First came Boniface VI, who lasted only 15 days before dying, possibly murdered. Then Stephen VI was elected pope in May 896. The circumstances of Stephen's election are murky, but the historical sources suggest that he was essentially the candidate of the Spoletan faction, a pope who owed his throne to Agiltrude and her allies among the Roman nobility. Stephen had his own reasons to hate Formosus. He had been ordained as Bishop of Anagni by Formosus, but under the strict interpretation of church law that prevailed in this era, Formosus's previous excommunication by Pope John VIII might have made all his subsequent ordinations invalid. If Formosus's actions as pope were illegitimate, then Stephen's own elevation to the episcopacy was null and void. By condemning Formosus, Stephen could retroactively legitimize his own position and, not coincidentally, satisfy his Spolitan patrons who hungered for vengeance against the pope who had tried to destroy them. And so, in January 897, less than a year after Formosus's death, Pope Stephen VI ordered that the body of his predecessor be exhumed from its tomb in St. Peter's. The corpse, 9 months in the grave, was dressed once more in papal vestments and carried to the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the Cathedral Church of Rome and the seat of the Bishop of Rome. There, before an assembly of Roman clergy, the trial began. It was officially called a synod, a church council convened to judge matters of doctrine and discipline, but history would remember it by a more visceral name: the Cadaver Synod, or in Latin the Synodus Horrenda, the Horrible Synod. The scene was like something from a nightmare. The decomposing body of Formosus sat on a throne, still wearing the sacred vestments of the papacy. Since the dead pope could not speak in his own defense, a deacon was assigned to stand beside the corpse and answer the charges on its behalf. But this was no real trial. It was theater, a grotesque spectacle designed to humiliate and destroy the memory of a man who could no longer defend himself. Pope Stephen VI, dressed in his own papal regalia, sat in judgment and personally hurled accusations at the silent, rotting figure before him. The charges were comprehensive and damning. Formosus had violated church law by transferring from the See of Porto to the papal throne, something forbidden by ancient canons. He had obtained the papacy through perjury and ambition. He had crowned Arnulf as emperor while Lambert still lived and held that dignity, thereby creating schism and disorder in the church. The poor deacon assigned to defend Formosus could do little but stammer weak responses. The outcome was never in doubt. The synod, made up largely of bishops and clergy who owed their positions to Stephen VI or the Spolitan faction, found Formosus guilty on all charges. The sentence was comprehensive in its vindictiveness. All of Formosus's acts as pope were declared null and void. Every ordination he had performed was invalidated, throwing the status of countless priests and bishops throughout Western Christendom into legal limbo. His papacy was erased from history, his name to be struck from the official records. But the humiliation did not end there. The papal vestments were stripped from the corpse. The 3 fingers of Formosus's right hand that had been used to give blessings were hacked off with a knife. The body was then dragged from the basilica, through the streets of Rome, and thrown into the Tiber River, cast out from the church he had led, denied even the dignity of Christian burial. The people of Rome watched this spectacle with growing horror and disgust. Whatever political crimes Formosus might have committed, whatever canonical irregularities marked his career, he had been their pope, a successor to St. Peter, and to treat his body with such contempt seemed not merely vindictive but sacrilegious. The Cadaver Synod violated basic human decency and, more importantly in the religious world of medieval Christendom, it seemed to mock the sacred dignity of the papal office itself. If a pope could be exhumed and tried as a criminal after death, what did that say about the special grace and authority that Christians believed invested the successors of St. Peter? The seeds of backlash were planted in those awful hours in the basilica, and they would germinate quickly. According to later chronicles, whose reliability is uncertain but whose symbolism is powerful, the body of Formosus did not remain in the muddy waters of the Tiber for long. A monk, or in some versions a fisherman, found the corpse floating in the river and retrieved it, hiding it away out of respect for the office Formosus had held. Meanwhile, strange omens began to appear in Rome. The Liber Pontificalis, the official papal chronicle, records that the Lateran Basilica itself was damaged when part of it collapsed, which contemporary Romans interpreted as divine judgment against the sacrilege that had been committed there. Whether by earthquake, structural failure, or simply the power of suggestion working on an already horrified populace, the damage to the building became a symbol of God's displeasure with Stephen VI and the Cadaver Synod. Popular outrage against Stephen VI grew through the spring and summer of 897. The Pope who had presided over such a grotesque spectacle found himself increasingly isolated. The Spolitan faction that had elevated him was losing its grip on Rome. Lambert and Agiltrud were focused on maintaining their control over northern Italy, and could not spare the military resources to prop up an unpopular pope in the capital. In August 897, barely 6 months after the Cadaver Synod, a popular uprising seized Stephen VI. He was stripped of his papal vestments, thrown into prison and strangled to death, murdered in his cell by persons unknown, though the suspects would have included much of the Roman nobility and clergy. His papacy had lasted little more than a year, and his reign ended as it had been conducted, in violence and chaos. The papal throne in the years immediately following the Cadaver Synod became a revolving door of short-lived pontificates. Romanus succeeded Stephen but lasted only 4 months before dying, possibly of natural causes, possibly not. Theodore II followed and immediately set about undoing the damage of the Cadaver Synod. In November 897, Theodore II convened his own synod, this one to rehabilitate Formosus. The body of the former pope, retrieved from its hiding place, was returned to Rome in solemn procession, dressed once more in papal vestments, and reburied with honor in St. Peter's Basilica. Theodore's synod declared the Cadaver Synod invalid, restored Formosus to the official lists of legitimate popes, and reinstated all the ordinations he had performed. Justice, it seemed, had been done, and the memory of Formosus had been vindicated. But Theodore II himself died after only 20 days as pope, leaving his work incomplete. John IX, who became pope in 898, carried on Theodore's efforts. He convened multiple synods to definitively condemn the Cadaver Synod and to enshrine in church law that no pope could be judged after death, that the dead were to be left in peace, and that such macabre trials were forbidden forever. John IX's synods also dealt with the practical problems created by the conflicting decisions about Formosus's ordinations. Many priests and bishops had been thrown into a state of canonical limbo when their ordinations were declared invalid during the Cadaver Synod, only to be reinstated by Theodore II, then potentially called into question again. John IX tried to provide pastoral solutions, allowing most of the clergy affected to be considered validly ordained, ending the uncertainty that had paralyzed parts of the Church's hierarchy. But even John IX's efforts could not fully erase the memory or the consequences of what had happened. The Cadaver Synod became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the papal politics of the age. Sergius III, who became pope in 904, was a partisan of the anti-Formosan faction and reportedly ordered that Formosus's body be exhumed yet again and subjected to further indignities, though the historical record here becomes confused and contradictory, tangled up with the propaganda of later factions. What is clear is that for decades afterward, the question of Formosus's legitimacy and the validity of the Cadaver Synod continued to divide the Roman clergy. Were the priests he ordained truly priests? Were the bishops he consecrated truly bishops? These questions mattered intensely in a world where the validity of the sacraments depended on the legitimacy of the priesthood administering them. The era that historians would later call the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Age of the Papacy, was just beginning. For the next 60 years, roughly from 900 to 960, the papal throne would be controlled by a succession of powerful Roman noble families, most notoriously the Theophylacti, who treated it as their personal property. Popes were appointed, deposed, and murdered with alarming regularity. The spiritual authority of the papacy sank to perhaps its lowest ebb, as the throne of St. Peter became a prize in the sordid power struggles of the Roman aristocracy. The Cadaver Synod, in retrospect, was both a symptom and a cause of this degradation. It was a symptom of how thoroughly the papacy had been captured by secular political interests, and it was a cause because the scandal it created further undermined whatever moral authority the popes of this era might have claimed. Yet, paradoxically, the very extremity of the Cadaver Synod would eventually contribute to the reform of the papacy. The image of a dead pope on trial, the sacrilege and indignity of it, burned itself into the memory of the Church. When reformers in the 11th and 12th centuries sought to restore the dignity and independence of the papal office, they pointed to horrors like the Cadaver Synod as examples of what happened when the Church was subordinated to secular power. The Gregorian Reform movement, named for Pope Gregory VII, who reigned from 1073 to 1085, aimed to free the Church from the control of emperors and kings, to establish the Pope as an independent spiritual authority who answered to no earthly power. The memory of popes murdered, deposed, or subjected to grotesque posthumous trials served as a powerful argument for why such reforms were necessary. The legal and theological questions raised by the Cadaver Synod also had long-lasting implications. Could a pope be judged by his successors? Could his acts be annulled? The principle that emerged from this crisis was that the pope could not be judged by any earthly tribunal, a doctrine that would become enshrined in canon law as prima sed nemine judicator. The first see is judged by no one. This principle of papal supremacy and immunity from judgment would become a cornerstone of medieval Catholic ecclesiology, though it would also lead to problems of its own when popes abused their power with no earthly check on their authority. The Cadaver Synod, in its very awfulness, had forced the Church to confront fundamental questions about the nature of papal authority and the limits of human judgment over God's vicar on earth. Historians looking back at the Cadaver Synod have struggled to fully explain why it happened. Was it purely political revenge by the Spolitan faction against a pope who had tried to destroy them? Certainly that was a major factor. Adultrude's influence over Stephen VI is well documented, and her hatred of Formosus was both personal and political. Was it about canonical legitimacy, a genuine concern among some in the Church about whether Formosus's transfer from Porto to Rome had been valid under Church law? Possibly, though the violence and vindictiveness of the trial suggest that pure legal concerns were not the primary motivation. Was it about power and resources, a struggle over church offices and their associated wealth and influence? Almost certainly this played a role as well, as invalidating Formosus's ordinations would have created vacancies that the new regime could fill with its own supporters. The most likely explanation is that the Cadaver Synod was all of these things at once. An act of political revenge, wrapped in a cloak of canonical justification, motivated by factional power struggles, and enabled by the chaotic conditions of late 9th century Italy where traditional norms and institutions had broken down. It was a perfect storm of personal hatred, political calculation, and institutional weakness, resulting in an event so bizarre and disturbing that it has echoed through history as the ultimate symbol of the papacy's medieval degradation. In the centuries that followed, the Cadaver Synod would be remembered, discussed, and used as a cautionary tale by theologians, historians, and political theorists. Medieval chroniclers like Liutprand of Cremona, writing in the 10th century, recounted the events with a mix of horror and fascination. Renaissance humanists, rediscovering the classical past and applying critical historical methods to church history, examined the conflicting sources about Formosus and the Synod, trying to determine what had actually happened behind the layers of propaganda and partisan accounts. Catholic apologists during the Reformation era had to grapple with the Cadaver Synod as Protestant critics pointed to it as evidence of the corruption and degradation of the medieval papacy. How could an institution that claimed to be the rock on which Christ built his church have descended to such depths? The Catholic response to this challenge evolved over time. Some apologists simply denied or minimized the event, suggesting that the sources were unreliable or that the accounts had been exaggerated by hostile chroniclers. Others acknowledged the reality of the Cadaver Synod but argued that it proved only the sinfulness of individual popes, not the falsity of the Catholic doctrine of papal authority. They pointed out that even in its darkest hour, the Church had survived, that reformers had eventually restored the papacy's dignity, and that the institution had outlasted the particular men who had disgraced it. The Cadaver Synod, in this interpretation, was a test that the Church had passed, emerging stronger and more conscious of the need to protect papal independence from secular interference. Modern historians, with access to a wider range of sources and the benefit of distance from the theological controversies of the Reformation, have been able to place the Cadaver Synod in its proper context as part of the political chaos of post-Carolingian Italy. The breakup of Charlemagne's empire had created a power vacuum that local strongmen rushed to fill, and the papacy, as both a spiritual institution and a temporal power controlling territory in central Italy, was inevitably caught up in these struggles. The Cadaver Synod was not an isolated aberration but part of a pattern of violence and instability that characterized the entire period. Popes were made and unmade by the same forces that elevated and destroyed kings and dukes across Europe during the 9th and 10th centuries. What made the Cadaver Synod unique was not its violence, which was common enough, but its macabre theatricality, the decision to put a corpse on trial in a grotesque parody of justice. The archaeological and artistic legacy of this period is sparse, as the chaos of the age was not conducive to great building projects or artistic patronage. The Lateran Basilica, site of the infamous trial, has been rebuilt multiple times since the 9th century, and nothing remains of the physical space where Formosus's body was judged. St. Peter's Basilica, where Formosus was buried, was completely rebuilt during the Renaissance, erasing any trace of his tomb. The documentary evidence consists mainly of the Liber Pontificalis, various chronicles written by monks and clergy in the decades and centuries after the events, and scattered references in letters and church records. These sources are often contradictory, reflecting the bitter partisan divisions of the time and the fact that later writers had their own agendas in recounting the story. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Cadaver Synod is what it reveals about medieval attitudes toward the body and death. The trial of a corpse seems bizarre to modern sensibilities, but it was not entirely without precedent in medieval legal thinking. The bodies of executed criminals were sometimes subjected to additional punishments after death, and there were traditions in Germanic law of treating a corpse as if it still possessed legal personality for certain purposes. What was unique about the Cadaver Synod was applying this kind of thinking to a pope, to someone who had been regarded as the spiritual father of Western Christendom. The violation was not in the idea of judging a dead body per se, but in doing so to someone whose office was supposed to be sacred and inviolable. The Cadaver Synod also raises profound questions about justice and revenge. Even if Formosus had been guilty of every charge leveled against him, and the historical evidence is far from clear on this point, what purpose did it serve to exhume his body and subject it to a show trial? Stephen VI and his supporters might have argued that they were defending the integrity of church law, ensuring that invalid ordinations were corrected and that the record showed Formosus for what they claimed he truly was, an ambitious usurper who had violated sacred canons. But to most observers, then and now, the Cadaver Synod looked more like vengeance than justice, an act of cruelty that said more about its perpetrators than its victim. The papacy would eventually recover from the degradations of the Saeculum Obscurum. The 11th century reforms, the rise of powerful reforming popes like Leo IX and Gregory VII, and the assertion of papal independence from secular control all contributed to restoring the prestige and authority of the office. By the High Middle Ages, the Pope had become the most powerful figure in Western Christendom, able to excommunicate emperors, launch crusades, and assert universal jurisdiction over the Church. The Cadaver Synod became a distant memory, a shameful episode that proved the need for a strong, independent papacy, free from the control of secular powers and local factions. Yet the story of Formosus and Stephen VI did not entirely fade from consciousness. It remained in the historical record, a reminder that institutions are only as good as the people who lead them, that power without accountability breeds corruption, and that the line between justice and revenge is easily crossed when passion and politics override principle. The Cadaver Synod stands as a monument to the fragility of civilization, showing how quickly order can descend into chaos when the normal constraints of law and decency break down. In an era when popes were supposed to be peacemakers and spiritual guides, Rome had instead witnessed something that would have seemed more at home in the pagan past. A ritual humiliation of the dead, a spectacle of cruelty dressed up in the language of law and religion. Today, more than 11 centuries after that horrible January day in 897, the Cadaver Synod remains one of the most infamous episodes in papal history. It has been the subject of historical studies, novels, plays, and even an opera. It appears in popular histories of the papacy as the supreme example of the degradation to which that institution sank during the Dark Ages. For secular critics of organized religion, it serves as evidence of how religious institutions, despite their claims to divine guidance, are subject to the same human failings and political corruption as any other institution. For believers, it serves as a reminder that the Church is made up of sinful human beings, that the promise that the gates of hell shall not prevail against it does not mean that individual churchmen, even popes, cannot fall into grievous sin. The legacy of the Cadaver Synod extends beyond church history into broader questions about power, authority, and the nature of justice. It asks us to consider what it means to hold power responsibly, what distinguishes legitimate authority from mere force, and whether institutions can maintain their moral authority when the individuals who lead them behave immorally. These are not merely historical questions but living ones, relevant to any age in which institutions claim special authority, and in which the powerful are tempted to abuse their positions for personal or factional gain. In the end, the story of the Cadaver Synod is a human story, a tale of ambition and revenge, of power sought and power abused, of institutions corrupted and eventually reformed. It is the story of Formosus, a capable churchman who rose to the papacy only to find himself trapped in an impossible political situation, trying to navigate between competing powers, each ready to destroy him if he chose the wrong side. It is the story of Stephen VI, a pope who may have believed he was defending church law, but who will forever be remembered for presiding over one of the most grotesque spectacles in Christian history. It is the story of Agiltrude and the Spolitan dynasty, powerful nobles who saw the papacy as a tool to legitimize their ambitions, and who were willing to desecrate the dead to revenge themselves on their enemies. And it is the story of Rome itself, the eternal city, which in the late 9th century was anything but eternal, a place where order had broken down, where the sacred and the profane had become hopelessly entangled, and where a corpse could be put on trial in the holiest basilica of Western Christendom. The body of Formosus rests today somewhere beneath the floors of St. Peter's Basilica, his exact tomb long since lost during the multiple reconstructions of that great church. But his memory endures, preserved in the chronicles and histories, in the records of the synods that condemned and then vindicated him, and in the darkly fascinating story of the Cadaver Synod. On that cold January day in 897, the Church faced one of its darkest hours, a moment when the institution that claimed to represent Christ on earth descended into a nightmare of its own making. That it survived, that it eventually reformed, that it ultimately endured as an institution for another 1,000 years and more, this is perhaps the most remarkable part of the story. The Cadaver Synod should have been the death knell of the medieval papacy. Instead, it became a warning, a reminder preserved through the centuries of what happens when power corrupts absolutely, and a testament to the strange resilience of institutions that, despite everything, somehow survive the worst their leaders can do to them.